Look! Look at those wonderful blue plumes of smoke. That wasn't dialogue from a science fiction movie. Those were the last words uttered by innocence, a deadly innocence. It was April 22nd, 1915, an unusually warm spring afternoon in Belgium. The sun was setting in the west, painting the muddy trenches of Ypres yellow. For the French soldiers of the 45th and 87th Divisions, this should have been a rare, peaceful afternoon. They were playing cards, writing letters home, or reheating dry pieces of bread over a small fire. They had no idea that just a few hundred meters away, across the land of no man, death carried no scythe. He carried no rifle or bayonet. He was waiting for the wind to change direction. And when he arrived in the form of a strange beauty. A wall of yellowish-green mist swirling low to the ground, soft as velvet, glistening in the setting sun. They stood on the trench to gaze at it. They pointed. They whispered. With curiosity, not fear. No one pulled the trigger. No one put on a gas mask. Simply because at that time, the concept of a gas mask didn't yet exist in the Allied military vocabulary. They thought it was a camouflage smokescreen, or a peculiar weather phenomenon of the Flanders lowlands. Today, we won't talk about dry military tactics. We will go back in time to that very moment, to understand why thousands of men stood frozen watching death approach, without knowing it. And more importantly, we will revisit the record of a crime. A crime not only committed by the German army, but by the arrogance and bureaucracy of the French command. Those who had been warned, but chose to ignore it. Welcome to Ypres, where curiosity kills faster than ballistic missiles. To understand this tragedy, you must first know who was holding the trenches that day. They were not the most elite units. If the Germans wanted to choose a weak point to test the most terrifying weapon in history, they chose very precisely. Defending the northern area of the Ypres promontory was a strange mix, a collection of soldiers considered second-rate in the eyes of the Parisian elite. First, there was the 87th Territorial Division. These weren't swaggering 20-year-olds. They were middle-aged men, mostly from Brittany and Normandy. Fathers, uncles, old farmers past military age, called back into service for logistical work. They were tired, poorly equipped, and all they hoped for was to get home in time for the harvest. Beside them was the Algerian 45th Division, comprising the Zouaves and Tirailleurs units. These were famously brave North African colonial soldiers. But in Europe in 1915, they were strangers in a cold land fighting for a motherland, a land many of them had never even set foot in. The combination of weary old soldiers and underestimated colonial troops created a dangerous complacency on the part of the high command. In the eyes of the generals sitting in their opulent castles, this area was safe. But this very complacency was the beginning of a death sentence. In reality, their trenches at Ypres were a sanitary nightmare. Corpses from the battles of 1914 still lay scattered, shallowly buried in the mud, reeking of decay whenever the weather warmed. The constant pungent smell of death served as the perfect cover. When your sense of smell has been numbed by the stench of decaying corpses for months, how can you distinguish a strange scent? A faint hint of pineapple and black pepper. That's the characteristic smell of chlorine gas. But the tragedy isn't in the nose. It's in the intelligence that was thrown into the trash. History often teaches us that the gas attack was a complete surprise. That is a lie. The truth is far darker. The Allies knew. They were warned, not just once, 9 days before the disaster. April 13th. A German deserter named August Jäger crossed the line to surrender to the French. He carried a secret that weighed heavily on his conscience. During his interrogation with General Edmond Ferry Jäger, confessed details so chilling they were horrifying. He spoke of thousands of steel cylinders buried deep underground. He said they contained a suffocating gas, and the Germans were just waiting for the wind to blow toward them. General Ferry believed the soldier. He sensed the sincerity in Jaeger's fear and immediately reported it to his superiors. But what was the response? Silence and ridicule. Senior officers argued that Germany had signed the Hague Convention prohibiting the use of poisons. And with the honor of military nobility, the Germans would never use such an inhuman weapon. That was 19th century thinking, imposed on the brutal industrial warfare of the 20th century. They even considered Jaeger a madman. All the pieces were there. Belgian intelligence reported the Germans placing thousands of cotton gauze pads. British reconnaissance pilots reported strange digging activity. But the whole picture was torn apart by human arrogance. No warning was given to the soldiers on the front lines. No wet rags. No psychological preparation. The warnings were forgotten. Until it was too late. Let's go back to that fateful 4 p.m. The atmosphere in the Ypres trenches was eerily silent. After weeks of relentless shelling, this silence felt like a gift. Captain Georges Lamoulin was writing in his diary describing the clear blue sky and the song of the nightingale. The North African soldiers were gathered cooking. The smells of coffee and cigarettes mingled. They didn't know that on the other side, less than 200 meters away, Colonel Peterson the German had received orders. German military meteorologists confirmed the wind was blowing from the north-northeast. The wind speed was perfect. It was the moment when science became the executioner. At exactly 5 p.m. A strange screeching sound rang out. The French soldiers looked up. They heard the screeching like steam escaping from a locomotive, but prolonged and simultaneous from hundreds of different points along the 6-kilometer front line. And then they saw it. From the ground on the German side, 2 streams of pale green gas erupted, merging to form a wall of mist about 2 meters high. Then it rose even higher. It wasn't gunpowder smoke, nor was it flare smoke. It had the color of an eerie emerald. A French officer observing through binoculars reported to headquarters, "There's a large fire in the German trench." They thought the Germans were creating a smoke screen to attack the infantry. Instinctively, the French officers ordered their soldiers to climb onto the firing platforms, preparing their rifles to engage the enemy. This was the most fatal mistake. Instead of seeking cover fleeing or finding higher ground, they climbed onto the trench walls, exposing their faces to the poisonous wind. They took deep breaths of the air to prepare for close combat. They breathed in death. Chlorine gas is extremely toxic. But at this moment, the cloud was still several hundred meters away. It was beautiful, shimmering in the afternoon sun, and drifting gently. Imagine you were there. You saw a beautiful blue mist creeping towards you. You smelled a pungent, sweet scent. Your eyes stung slightly. You turned to your comrade and asked, "What the hell is this?" and received a shrug in response. The Germans must be up to something again. You didn't run, because humans are usually more curious about strange phenomena than immediately frightened by them. And that curiosity, in the context of World War I, was a one-way ticket to hell. The blue cloud glided over the uninhabited land. The vegetation withered instantly as it passed. Rats scurried about and then fell dead, convulsing. Birds in flight suddenly plummeted to the ground like stones. And then, the edge of the cloud touched the edge of the French trenches. The real nightmare began. Not with gunshots, but with coughing. Thousands of coughs simultaneously tore through the quiet afternoon, heralding the start of a devastating era of chemical warfare. The nightmare didn't arrive with a deafening explosion, but with a deadly silence. It seeped into every crevice of the lungs. As the edge of that yellowish-green cloud crept across the trench, touching the mud-stained boots of the Zouave soldiers, their world collapsed forever. Imagine you were there. The first moment wasn't pain. It was astonishment. A pungent, acrid smell assaulted your nostrils, more intense than any bleach you'd ever smelled, mixed with the sickening sweetness of metal and rotten pineapple. You coughed once, then twice. You rubbed your eyes stinging from the sudden irritation, and then hell opened up in your chest. Chlorine gas doesn't kill instantly like a bullet to the heart. It's far more insidious. It tortures the victim from the inside. When chlorine gas comes into contact with the moist mucous membranes of the throat and lungs, a fundamental but terrifying chemical reaction occurs. It combines with water to form hydrochloric acid. To put it bluntly, those poor French soldiers were being burned from the inside. Their lungs began to melt. Their bodies reacted by secreting fluids to flush out the acid, but this very defense mechanism became a death sentence. The fluids flooded their lungs faster than they could cough them up. They began to drown, drowning on dry land. In the middle of a dry spring afternoon, chaos erupted immediately. The Zouave soldiers, brave North African warriors who had faced lions and desert sandstorms, were now completely overwhelmed by this dark magic. They couldn't see their enemy to fire back. They only saw the air around them turn into a killer. They clutched their throats. Their eyes bulged. Foaming at the mouth was pink, a mixture of blood and lung fluid. Screams were choked in their throats, replaced by hissing, gurgling sounds like boiling water. Military discipline collapsed in an instant. No officer could order a suffocating soldier to stand still. Survival instinct surged more powerfully than ever. They threw away their weapons. They threw away their backpacks. They threw away even their soldiers' honor. They turned and ran. 6,000 men fled at once. Imagine that scene. It wasn't a tactical retreat. It was a flood of panic. They ran frantically backward, colliding with each other, trampling over each other. Those who fell never got up again, because chlorine gas is heavier than air. It settled in the depressions, turning bomb craters and shallow trenches into death traps. Anyone who fell in was as good as dead. On the roads leading to Ypres, the scene was even more horrific. Ambulances, horse-drawn carts loaded with ammunition, and streams of refugees were swept up in a whirlwind of soldiers driven mad with pain. Zouave soldiers ran past their faces, purple pointing behind them, trying to shout, "Gas! Gas!" But only meaningless wheezing sounds came out. A huge gap, more than 6 kilometers long, had been torn open in the middle of the Allied front. The northern defense line of Ypres had completely evaporated. No more machine guns, no more artillery. Not a single soldier stood. The road to Ypres and beyond to the sea was completely open to the Germans. If the Germans had advanced at that moment, they could have ended the war that very night. But history is full of ironic paradoxes. Even the Germans themselves were caught off guard by their overwhelming success. They hadn't expected this experimental weapon to be so destructively effective. The German command hadn't prepared sufficient reserves. The German infantrymen wearing rudimentary masks advanced cautiously. They were afraid too. They passed through trenches littered with purple corpses. They saw faces contorted with extreme pain, and they themselves hesitated before the hellish scene created by their own side. The German hesitation gave the Allied forces a slim chance, a narrow window of opportunity to salvage the situation, and that narrow window lay on the left flank of the poisonous cloud, the encampment of the 1st Canadian Division. Unlike the French soldiers who had been directly hit by the storm, the Canadians on the flank were only swept by the edge of the cloud, but they had witnessed it all. From their position, they saw the green wall engulfing their allies. They saw the panicked masses fleeing. And they knew, in just a few minutes, that cloud would reach them. Or worse, the Germans would pour through the huge gap beside them and attack their flank. Fear was clearly visible on the faces of the young men from Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. This was their first major battle on European soil. They had never seen anything like it. Their eyes began to sting. Their breathing became labored. Should they run? Their French allies had all fled. Why should they stay to die a painful and meaningless death? It was in that moment of life and death, a moment of extreme peril, that science and quick thinking intervened. But in the crudest and most bizarre way you can imagine. Among the Canadian Medical Corps was a man named Francis Scrimger. The moment he smelled the distinctive pungent odor, he immediately recognized it as chlorine. He knew that chlorine was a highly acidic gas, and to neutralize the acid, you needed an alkaline solution. But in the muddy trenches, under artillery fire, and the onslaught of poison gas, where would you find an alkaline solution? No laboratory, no well-stocked medicine cabinet. The answer lay within each soldier's body. Ammonia. Urine contained ammonia. The most bizarre order in military history was passed down upon the trenches of the Canadian Army. The officers ran along the trench shouting at the bewildered soldiers, "Pee on your handkerchief immediately. Get your handkerchief. Pee on it. And cover your nose." Can you imagine the soldiers' confusion? Facing imminent death, they were ordered to do something unsanitary and ridiculous. But they did it. Desperation makes people cling to anything. Thousands of Canadian soldiers in the dim twilight and the hazy blue smoke frantically rummaged through their pockets, pulling out their personal handkerchiefs or tearing open their shirts and urinating on them. Then they tied the stale, urine-soaked pieces of cloth over their faces, covering their noses and mouths. These were the first gas masks of World War I. Not rubber, not activated charcoal, but cotton and urine. And a miracle happened. The ammonia in their urine reacted with the chlorine gas, partially neutralizing its toxicity. It wasn't perfect. It still stinked. They still struggled to breathe. Their eyes still stung as if chili peppers had been rubbed into them. But it saved them. It prevented them from drowning in their own lungs, like the poor French soldiers a few hundred meters away. Thanks to those disgusting masks, the Canadians didn't flee. They held their ground in the trenches. Amidst the toxic smoke, they squinted through their rifle sights, waiting for the gray uniforms of the Germans to appear. They coughed incessantly. Tears and snot streamed down their faces, but their fingers remained on the triggers. As the German infantry cautiously advanced into what they thought was an open space, they were suddenly met with fierce resistance. The Canadian soldiers, their faces covered with wet rags, looked like highway robbers and unleashed a frenzied barrage of gunfire on the enemy. The Germans halted. They couldn't understand why these men were still alive. According to their calculations, no one could have survived that level of toxic gas without specialized equipment. That night, the Second Battle of Ypres didn't end with the complete collapse of the Allied forces as the Germans had anticipated. It entered a new phase, a bloody war in the shadows. One side tried to widen the gap while the other tried to patch it up, with their own bodies. We stand at midnight, the dawn of April 23, 1915. Although the urine solution had helped the Canadian soldiers hold on to part of the trenches, the overall situation remained utterly desperate. A vast gap still loomed in the front. The Germans had captured the strategic oak grove known as Kitchener's Wood, and they were hastily digging trenches and setting up machine gun emplacements there. If the Germans held this grove through the night, tomorrow they would have the perfect springboard to penetrate the British flank and wipe out the entire Allied force at Ypres. The order from headquarters was short and ruthless. Counterattack immediately. Retake the grove at all costs. There was no time for reconnaissance, no artillery support to clear the way. No one knew how many German soldiers or how many machine guns were waiting in that pitch-black grove. This suicide mission was assigned to 2 Canadian battalions, the 10th Battalion and the 16th Battalion Canadian Scottish Army. Imagine the scene. Over 1,500 men gathered in the cold darkness. They had just experienced the shock of poison gas. Their eyes were still bloodshot and stinging. Their throats were still sore. But they were silently lining up bayonets fitted to their rifles. The 16th Battalion consisted of soldiers wearing traditional Scottish kilts. In the cold of the Flanders night, they stood there trembling not from fear, but from the cold and adrenaline. At exactly 11:45 p.m., the order to depart was given. They didn't run. They walked. The tactics of the time required them to move in absolute silence to create an element of surprise. 1,500 men moved across the open field toward the dark forest ahead. Not a sound was heard. Not a single firelight. Only the rustling of footsteps on the wet grass and the sound of heavy breathing. They approached a barbed wire fence about 200 meters from the edge of the forest. Everything was still silent. It seemed the Germans hadn't discovered them yet, but luck wasn't on their side tonight. A click echoed. Perhaps someone had tripped over the wire, or a rifle butt had struck a water bottle. That small sound in the still night was like a clap of thunder. Immediately, the night sky blazed. The Germans fired flares into the air. The blinding magnesium light hung suspended, turning night into day, exposing all 1,500 Canadian soldiers naked in the open field. And then, death spoke. Dozens of German MG-08 machine guns from the edge of the forest opened fire simultaneously. You can't imagine the sound. It was like canvas being torn apart. The bullets flew so densely that it was said the air itself was heated. The first line of Canadian soldiers fell like harvested wheat. No one could utter a sound. They died instantly. But then the most miraculous and insane thing happened. Instead of lying down for cover or fleeing, the remaining soldiers roared in unison, charging forward. They didn't need orders from their officers. The instinct of rage erupted. They charged straight into the wall of bullets. The 10th and 16th Battalions ran across that deadly 200 meters. One fell, another stepped over the corpses to advance. A Canadian officer shot in the stomach still managed to crawl, waving his baton before finally collapsing. They rushed into the edge of Kitchener Forest. And here, the fighting shifted from guns and bullets to something more primitive: bayonet, rifle butt, and fists. In the dense darkness of the forest, no one could distinguish friend from foe. They slashed and hacked at any shadow moving in the opposite direction. Gunfire rang out at close range. Bones broke. Shouts in German, English, and French mingled together. It was no longer war. It was a bloody brawl in a cage. A Canadian soldier recounted how he jumped into a machine gun emplacement using a shovel to smash the gun and the German soldiers operating it. Savagery reigned supreme. After nearly an hour of frenzied slaughter, the gunfire gradually ceased. The Canadians had captured the forest. They had accomplished the impossible. They had sealed the deadly gap created by the poison gas. But the price was too high. When dawn broke on April 23rd, Kitchener Forest looked like a slaughterhouse. The 10th Battalion alone of the 816 soldiers who went into battle last night. When the roll call came the next morning, only 193 remained. More than 75% of their force had been wiped out in just a few hours. Their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Russ Boyle, was found slumped beside an oak tree, riddled with bullets, but still clutching his empty pistol. They had won, but it was a hollow victory. They looked around at the piles of corpses, both Canadian and German, and wondered, was this price worth it for these few hundred meters of charred forest? But they had no time for sorrow. For in the distance, German artillery began roaring again, and a new wave of poison gas was being prepared. The Second Battle of Ypres was not over. It had only shed its initial exploratory cloak, revealing its truly brutal face. And in the next final part of this series, we will come to the conclusion of the tragedy. We will talk about the legacy of that day, about the most famous poem of World War I, written amidst freshly dug graves, and about how the world changed forever after the blue smoke cleared. Dawn broke over Ypres on April 24th, but the sunlight offered no hope. It only highlighted the brutality of the previous 2 nights. The chlorine gas nightmare didn't end with the first attack. In the following days, the Germans continued to unleash the toxic gas repeatedly. The Canadian, British, and French soldiers, those who survived, had to continue fighting in exhaustion, their lungs burning and their eyes swollen. But it was in those darkest hours, amidst the stench of corpses and the pungent smell of chemicals, that something heartbreakingly beautiful was born. At the Canadian medical station, there was a military doctor named John McCrae. He had witnessed it all. He had seen young men drowning on dry land, their lungs overflowing with fluid. He had amputated limbs shattered by artillery fire. But the greatest pain came when his closest friend, Lieutenant Alexis Helmer, was blown up by a shell right before his eyes. Helmer's body was not intact. John McCrae and his comrades had to gather his friend's remains in a military blanket and hastily bury them on the battlefield. The next morning, sitting on the steps of the ambulance looking out at the newly dug field cemetery, where wooden crosses stood side by side, John McCrae saw a strange image. Amidst the land ravaged by bombs and bullets where no grass could survive, bright red poppies still bloomed. They blossomed among the graves. The red of the flowers mingled with the blood of the fallen soldiers. In those brief 20 minutes, wiping away tears and exhaustion, John McCrae wrote the poem, "In Flanders Fields." In the fields of Flanders, poppies bloom, among rows of crosses one after another. That poem later became a symbol of World War I. It is often recited at solemn memorial ceremonies. But few remember that it was written amidst poison gas swarms of flies and the utter despair of witnessing the agonizing deaths of thousands by an inhuman weapon. The Second Battle of Ypres lasted over a month. When the last shot ceased at the end of May, the casualty figures were horrific. Over 70,000 Allied soldiers were killed or wounded. The Germans also lost over 35,000. The 1st Canadian Division, who used urine-soaked handkerchiefs to hold their ground, lost more than half their men. 6,000 fell, earning the reputation of being the bravest warriors on the Western Front. But the true legacy of Ypres is not the numbers. It is the permanent change in the nature of warfare. Before April 22, 1915, war still retained some semblance of honor. People believed in justice. People believed in the rule of law. But after that green smoke was released, innocence died. Ypres marked the beginning of modern chemical warfare. Pandora's box had been opened, and no one could close it again. The Allied powers, after condemning the Germans as barbarians, immediately launched a chemical arms race. Just months later, the British themselves used poison gas to attack the Germans at the Battle of Loos. From chlorine, they moved on to phosgene, a colorless, odorless gas that kills slowly over 48 hours. Then came mustard gas, causing skin ulcers and permanent blindness. Gas masks became indispensable. The soldiers' faces disappeared behind layers of rubber and lifeless goggles, making them look more like monsters than human beings. War was no longer a contest between men, but an industrial slaughter where science and technology were used to find the most effective and painful ways to kill. And the soldiers who survived and returned from Ypres, they carried wounds that would never heal. Years after the war, Canadian veterans still often wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, clutching their throats. Just smelling bleach or burning grass brings back memories of that green cloud. Their lungs were permanently damaged. Their lifespans were shortened. They won that battle, but they left a part of their souls behind in Flanders forever. Ultimately, looking back on this event, we realize a bitter lesson that in war, the line between civilization and barbarism is thinner than a wisp of smoke. Look at those magnificent blue smokes. That was the opening line of the tragedy. And it's also the most haunting reminder of the devastation humans can inflict on their fellow human beings simply because of pride and hatred. Those soldiers, they rest peacefully beneath the poppy fields. But the ghost of Ypres, the ghost of the Emerald Cloud, still lingers somewhere in human history, reminding us that when the wind changes direction, death will come. Thank you for watching this series. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to join us in uncovering forgotten war records. And now, goodbye, and see you again.